The story of Canada begins not with the arrival of Europeans, but with a land that was already ancient, already alive with the voices of countless generations. Picture this: vast wilderness stretching from ocean to ocean to ocean, where massive glaciers once carved valleys that would become the backbone of a nation. This is the tale of how a frozen frontier became one of the world's most influential countries, and trust me, it's nothing like what you learned in school. Most people think Canadian history is boring. They imagine polite people saying sorry while riding moose through endless snow. But the real story, it's filled with brutal wars, shocking betrayals, incredible survival stories, and moments that literally changed the course of world history. From ancient civilizations that built cities before Rome existed, to modern battles that decided the fate of democracy itself, Canada's past is absolutely wild. But here's what's really fascinating. Canada as we know it today almost never happened. There were countless moments when everything could have gone differently, when this massive country could have been carved up, conquered, or completely erased from existence. The fact that you're looking at a map with Canada on it right now is actually kind of miraculous. And by the end of this series, you're going to understand exactly why Canada matters so much more than most people realize. We're talking about a country that helped save Britain during its darkest hour, that gave birth to technologies you use every day, and that quietly influenced major world events in ways that would shock you. Plus, I'll show you the real stories behind the myths, the incredible individuals who shaped this nation, and the moments that prove Canadian history is anything but peaceful and boring. But we have to start at the very beginning, and I mean the very beginning. Long before anyone called this place Canada, long before Europeans had any idea this continent existed, this land was home to some of the most sophisticated and complex societies on Earth. The story truly begins around 15,000 years ago, when the last ice age was finally releasing its grip on North America. Massive ice sheets, some over a mile thick, had covered most of what we now call Canada for thousands of years. But as the climate warmed, these glaciers began their slow retreat northward, leaving behind a landscape that was both devastated and reborn. As the ice melted, it created something incredible: land bridges and ice-free corridors that allowed the first humans to migrate into this new territory. These weren't random wanderers stumbling around in the wilderness. These were skilled hunters, sophisticated tool makers, and organized societies who had already mastered survival in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Archaeological evidence shows us that these first peoples arrived in waves, bringing with them different technologies, languages, and ways of life. Some came along the Pacific coast, following the retreating ice and rich marine resources. Others traveled through inland corridors, tracking massive herds of mammoths, giant bison, and other megafauna that roamed the newly exposed grasslands. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how quickly these groups adapted to their new environment. Within just a few centuries, they had spread across the entire continent, developing distinct cultures perfectly suited to everything from Arctic tundra to temperate rainforests. They weren't just surviving in this landscape, they were thriving, building complex societies that would endure for thousands of years. Take the people of the Pacific Northwest, for example. By 8,000 years ago, they had developed one of the most sophisticated non-agricultural societies in human history. They built massive cedar longhouses that could shelter dozens of families. They carved intricate totem poles that told stories spanning generations. They developed a complex economy based on salmon runs so abundant that early European explorers couldn't believe their eyes. These weren't simple hunter-gatherers living hand to mouth. They had permanent villages, complex social hierarchies, elaborate ceremonies, and trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles. They had chiefs and nobles, artists and shamans, warriors and diplomats. They had laws and customs that governed everything from marriage to warfare to the proper way to harvest resources without depleting them. Meanwhile, in what we now call the Great Lakes region, Other groups were developing their own remarkable civilizations. The ancestors of the Iroquois and Algonquian peoples were creating sophisticated agricultural systems, growing corn, beans, and squash in combinations that modern scientists now recognize as incredibly advanced sustainable farming techniques. They built fortified villages with palisades and earthworks that could house thousands of people. They developed democratic decision-making processes that would later influence the formation of both the United States Constitution and Canadian parliamentary democracy. They had complex alliances and confederacies that maintained peace and trade across vast territories for centuries at a time. But here's what's really incredible. These societies weren't static. They were constantly evolving, adapting, innovating. Around 1,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. Groups across the continent began developing increasingly complex technologies and social structures. They built massive earthen mounds and ceremonial centers. They developed new weapons, new tools, new ways of organizing their communities. In the Arctic, the Thule people were perfecting technologies that allowed them to hunt whales and survive in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. They developed sophisticated ice houses, advanced kayak designs, and hunting techniques so effective that they remained virtually unchanged for centuries. On the Great Plains, various groups were becoming master buffalo hunters, developing techniques for driving entire herds over cliffs and preserving thousands of pounds of meat for the long winter months. They created portable societies that could follow the herds across hundreds of miles, maintaining complex social structures while constantly on the move. And in the eastern woodlands, groups were building permanent towns and developing agricultural techniques that could feed populations in the thousands. They were creating art, developing writing systems, building monuments that required coordinated effort from hundreds of people. By the time European explorers first glimpsed the shores of what they would call the New World, they weren't looking at an empty wilderness. They were looking at a continent that had been home to millions of people for thousands of years. These were people who had names for every river, every mountain, every significant landmark. People who had histories stretching back dozens of generations. People who had already explored, mapped, and settled every corner of this vast territory. But the Europeans didn't see it that way. To them, this was terra nullius, empty land waiting to be claimed. This fundamental misunderstanding would shape the next 500 years of Canadian history in ways both tragic and profound. The first Europeans to reach what we now call Canada weren't the Vikings, though they did establish temporary settlements in Newfoundland around 1,000 years ago. The first sustained European contact came much later, and it came from an unexpected direction. In the early 1500s, European fishing fleets had been working the Grand Banks off Newfoundland for decades. These weren't exploration voyages or colonial expeditions. These were business trips. The cod fishery was so rich that it was worth the dangerous Atlantic crossing just to fill their ships and sail home with enough fish to feed Europe. But some of these fishermen began venturing closer to shore, and what they found changed everything. The indigenous peoples they encountered weren't the primitive savages that European propaganda would later portray. They were skilled traders who had been managing complex economies for centuries. They had furs that European markets desperately wanted, and they were eager to trade for European goods that could improve their own lives. This is where the real story of European involvement in Canada begins, not with grand colonial schemes or religious missions, but with mutually beneficial trade relationships that made both sides wealthier and more powerful. The French were the first to really understand what they had stumbled upon. While the Spanish were conquering gold-rich empires in Central and South America, and the English were focused on establishing agricultural colonies in warmer climates, the French realized that the northern territories of North America offered something potentially even more valuable, the richest fur-bearing region on the planet. Jacques Cartier made 3 voyages to the St. Lawrence River region in the 1530s and 1540s, but he was looking for something that didn't exist. a passage to Asia and cities full of gold, like the Spanish had found further south. What he actually found was far more significant in the long run, though he didn't realize it at the time. He found a river system that provided access to the heart of the continent. He found indigenous peoples who were already part of vast trade networks, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And he found a land rich in resources that European markets would pay handsomely for, if anyone could figure out how to exploit them efficiently. But Cartier's expeditions were also marked by misunderstandings and conflicts that would set troubling precedents for future European-indigenous relations. He kidnapped indigenous leaders to take back to France as curiosities. He claimed vast territories for the French crown without any consultation with the people who actually lived there. He established patterns of European behavior that would have devastating consequences for indigenous peoples across the continent. Still, the real colonial period didn't begin immediately. For several decades after Cartier's voyages, European involvement in the region remained limited to seasonal fishing and trading expeditions. The harsh winters, the vast distances, and the lack of obvious mineral wealth made permanent settlement seem impractical to most Europeans. That changed in 1608, when Samuel de Champlain established a permanent settlement at Quebec. This wasn't just another temporary trading post. This was the beginning of New France, and it would fundamentally alter the trajectory of North American history. Champlain wasn't just an explorer or a merchant. He was a visionary who understood that success in this new world would require cooperation with indigenous peoples, not just exploitation of them. He formed alliances with local groups, learned their languages, adopted many of their techniques for surviving in the Canadian wilderness. But he also brought European diseases, European weapons, and European ideas about land ownership that would devastate indigenous societies. The alliance system he created drew his French settlers into indigenous conflicts that had been going on for generations, turning local disputes into international wars. The establishment of Quebec marked the beginning of a new chapter in Canadian history, one that would be defined by the complex, often violent, always fascinating interactions between European and indigenous peoples. It was the start of New France, which would grow to encompass much of what we now call Eastern Canada and the American Midwest. But New France was unlike any other European colony in North America. It was built on the fur trade, which required cooperation with indigenous peoples rather than displacement of them. It was Catholic rather than Protestant, French rather than English, and it developed its own unique culture that was neither fully European nor fully North American. The story of New France is the story of coureurs de bois, French adventurers who adopted indigenous ways of life and travelled thousands of miles through the wilderness in birch bark canoes. It's the story of Jesuit missionaries who tried to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity while often adopting indigenous survival techniques themselves. It's the story of filles du roi, young women brought from France to marry colonists and help establish permanent communities in the wilderness. But it's also the story of devastating epidemics that killed up to 90% of indigenous peoples in some regions. It's the story of the Beaver Wars, conflicts between indigenous groups that were intensified by European weapons and European demand for furs. It's the story of cultural misunderstandings that led to violence, exploitation, and the gradual erosion of indigenous sovereignty across vast territories. By the mid-1600s, New France had become something unprecedented in the history of European colonization. This wasn't the story of conquistadors destroying empires or Puritan settlers clearing the wilderness. This was something entirely different, a colony that depended on maintaining the wilderness, not taming it. The fur trade created a unique society where European colonists had to adapt to indigenous ways of life rather than the other way around. French traders learned to paddle birchbark canoes through rapids that would terrify modern whitewater enthusiasts. They learned to survive Arctic winters, using techniques that indigenous peoples had perfected over thousands of years. They learned indigenous languages, married into indigenous families, and became part of trade networks that stretched from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. But here's what makes this period absolutely fascinating. While this cultural blending was creating something new and remarkable, it was also setting the stage for conflicts that would reshape the entire continent. The fur trade wasn't just about beaver pelts and European fashion. It was about control of the most lucrative industry in North America. And that control would determine which European power dominated the continent. The English had been watching French expansion with growing alarm. While New France remained relatively small in terms of population, French explorers and traders were claiming vast territories across the interior of the continent. By the 1670s, French expeditions led by men like René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, had traveled down the Mississippi River all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, claiming the entire watershed for France. Think about what this meant. If these claims held, France would control not just what we now call Eastern Canada, but also the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley, and the entire Mississippi River system. That's roughly half of what would become the United States, plus most of Eastern Canada. The English colonies along the Atlantic coast would be trapped between French territory and the ocean, unable to expand westward. This is when the real struggle for North America began. It wasn't just about trade routes or territorial claims anymore. It was about which European power would dominate an entire continent, and by extension, which culture, which language, which way of life would shape the future of North America. The English response was typically English. They formed a company. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, was given trading rights over all the land whose rivers drained into Hudson Bay. Now, here's the thing that's absolutely mind-blowing about this charter. Nobody really knew how much land that included. The Hudson Bay watershed covers over 1.5 million square miles. That's larger than India. The English had just granted a private company control over roughly 40% of what would become Canada. But the Hudson's Bay Company wasn't interested in settlement or territorial control in the traditional sense. They were interested in profits, and they developed a business model that was brilliantly simple. Build trading posts at strategic locations along the coast of Hudson Bay, let indigenous trappers bring furs to them, and ship everything back to London. No expensive colonial administration, no need to explore or map vast territories, no complex alliances with dozens of different indigenous groups. The French, meanwhile, were pursuing a completely different strategy. They were pushing deeper and deeper into the continent, establishing trading posts and missions in what are now Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and even Alberta. French voyageurs were paddling canoes through river systems that wouldn't appear on English maps for another century. This created one of the most fascinating periods in Canadian history, the era of the great fur trade rivalry. For nearly a century, French and English traders competed for control of the North American fur trade, and this competition would determine not just the economic future of the region, but its political and cultural future as well. The competition wasn't just between Europeans either. Indigenous peoples quickly realized that they could play European powers against each other to get better trading terms, more favorable alliances, and access to European weapons and technology. Groups like the Iroquois Confederacy became sophisticated diplomatic powers, sometimes allying with the English against the French, sometimes switching sides when it served their interests. But this period also saw some of the most devastating conflicts in North American history. The Beaver Wars of the mid-1600s were essentially proxy wars between European powers, fought primarily by indigenous allies using European weapons. Entire peoples were displaced or destroyed. Traditional territories were abandoned. Ancient trade routes were disrupted. The Huron Confederacy, which had been one of New France's most important allies, was virtually destroyed by Iroquois attacks in the late 1640s. Thousands of Huron people were killed, captured, or forced to flee their traditional territories. The Jesuit missions that had been established in Huron territory were abandoned or destroyed. French traders lost access to one of their most important sources of furs. This wasn't just a local conflict either. The destruction of the Huron Confederacy fundamentally altered the balance of power in northeastern North America. It gave the Iroquois Confederacy, which was allied with the English, control over much of the Great Lakes fur trade. It forced the French to find new allies and new sources of furs. It demonstrated that European colonization wasn't just changing indigenous societies, it was sometimes destroying them entirely. Yet even as these conflicts raged, something remarkable was happening in the heart of New France. A distinct society was emerging, one that was neither fully French nor fully indigenous, but something entirely new. The habitants of New France were developing their own culture, their own ways of speaking French, their own traditions and customs. They were also proving that European-style agriculture could work in the Canadian climate. The seigneurial system that the French had established along the St. Lawrence River was producing enough food to feed the growing colonial population. Towns like Montreal and Trois-Rivières were becoming genuine urban centres with their own merchants, craftsmen, and professionals. By the early 1700s, New France had a population of around 15,000 European settlers, plus thousands of Métis people of mixed European and Indigenous ancestry. This might seem tiny compared to the English colonies to the south, which had populations in the hundreds of thousands. But New France punched well above its weight in terms of territorial control and economic influence. The reason was simple. While English colonists were primarily farmers who needed to clear land and establish permanent settlements, French colonists were primarily traders and missionaries who could operate effectively across vast territories without needing to control them in the traditional sense. A few hundred French voyageurs could maintain trading relationships across territories that would require thousands of English settlers to control through conventional colonization. This fundamental difference in colonial strategy would define the struggle for North America for the next century. The English had numbers and resources, but the French had mobility and indigenous allies. The English controlled the Atlantic coast and had secure supply lines to Europe, but the French controlled the interior river systems and the most valuable fur-bearing territories. The stage was set for a series of conflicts that would determine not just the future of Canada, but the future of all of North America. These weren't going to be simple colonial skirmishes either. They were going to be part of larger global conflicts between European powers, wars that would be fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and India. The first of these major conflicts was King William's War, fought between 1689 and 1697. In Europe, this was known as the War of the League of Augsburg, and it pitted France against a coalition of European powers, including England, the Netherlands, and various German states. In North America, it became a brutal frontier war between New France and the English colonies. French and indigenous war parties launched devastating raids against English settlements in New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. The English retaliated with attacks on French settlements in Acadia, in what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Neither side achieved decisive victory, but both sides learned valuable lessons about frontier warfare that would shape future conflicts. What's remarkable about these early conflicts is how they demonstrated the importance of indigenous allies. Neither the French nor the English could hope to control the vast territories of northeastern North America without indigenous support. The French generally had better relationships with indigenous peoples, partly because their economic model required cooperation rather than displacement, and partly because French culture seemed more adaptable to indigenous ways of life. But the English had advantages too. They had larger populations, more secure supply lines, and growing industrial capacity. As the 18th century progressed, these advantages would become increasingly important. The second major conflict, Queen Anne's War, erupted in 1702 and would prove even more devastating than the first. This time, the stakes were higher, the tactics more brutal, and the consequences more far-reaching. What started as another European power struggle quickly became something much more significant, a war that would begin to determine the ultimate fate of North America. The French strategy was audacious and terrifying. Instead of trying to match English numbers with conventional warfare, they unleashed a campaign of frontier terror that would haunt English colonists for generations. French officers, like Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, didn't just raid English settlements, they systematically destroyed them, leaving behind smoking ruins and traumatized survivors who spread tales of French and Indigenous brutality throughout the English colonies. The raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1704 became legendary for its savagery. French and Indigenous warriors struck in the dead of winter, killing dozens of colonists and marching over 100 prisoners through the frozen wilderness to Canada. Many prisoners died on the march, but those who survived found themselves in a strange situation. They were often treated well by their French captors, and some chose to remain in New France rather than return to their former homes. This prisoner exchange system created something unexpected, a network of people who understood both French and English colonial society intimately. These cultural bridge builders would play crucial roles in later conflicts and negotiations, but they also demonstrated how the rigid boundaries between European colonies were actually much more porous than official maps suggested. Meanwhile, the English were learning their own lessons about frontier warfare. They couldn't match French mobility or Indigenous alliances, but they could use their naval superiority to attack French positions along the coast. The capture of Port Royal in Acadia in 1710 gave the English their first major territorial gain in what would become Canada, and it established a pattern that would define future English strategy. Use naval power to isolate French positions, then capture them with overwhelming force. But here's what makes this period absolutely fascinating. While these brutal wars were raging along the frontiers, something remarkable was happening in the interior of the continent. French explorers and traders were pushing further west than any European had ever gone, establishing trading posts and alliances across the vast prairies and into the Rocky Mountains. Pierre Gaultier de Varennes, Sieur de la Vérendrye, and his sons spent decades in the 1730s and 1740s exploring what are now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and even parts of North Dakota and Montana. They weren't just passing through either. They were establishing permanent trading relationships with Indigenous peoples who had never seen Europeans before, creating a French presence that stretched literally from the Atlantic to the foothills of the Rockies. Think about what this meant in practical terms. By the mid-1700s, a French trader could theoretically travel by canoe and portage from Montreal to the Saskatchewan River, a distance of over 2,000 miles, while staying entirely within French-controlled territory and relying on French trading posts for supplies and support. This was an achievement in exploration and logistics that rivaled anything accomplished by any empire in human history. But this vast territorial expansion came with a critical weakness. It was incredibly difficult to defend. New France in the 1740s controlled more territory than any European colony had ever attempted to govern. But it did so with a total European population of less than 60,000 people. The English colonies, by contrast, had over 1 million European settlers concentrated in a much smaller area along the Atlantic coast. This population disparity was becoming impossible to ignore. While individual French colonists might be more skilled at wilderness survival and Indigenous diplomacy, the English had numbers that could overwhelm any French position if properly concentrated and supplied. The question was whether the English could learn to fight effectively in the North American wilderness before the French could find ways to increase their population. The answer came during King George's War in the 1740s. This conflict saw the first major English success against a heavily fortified French position when New England militia captured the fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. Louisbourg was supposed to be impregnable, the Gibraltar of North America, protecting French access to the St. Lawrence River and the heart of New France. The fact that colonial militia could capture such a fortress shocked both sides and demonstrated that English colonists were finally learning how to fight effectively in North American conditions. But the aftermath was even more significant. When the war ended, European diplomats gave Louisbourg back to France in exchange for concessions in Europe, enraging the English colonists who had paid for its capture with their blood and treasure. This diplomatic betrayal taught English colonists a crucial lesson. European powers would sacrifice colonial interests for European advantages whenever it suited them. This realization would have profound consequences for the future relationship between English colonies and the mother country, but in the short term, it simply intensified colonial determination to drive the French out of North America permanently. The stage was now set for the final and most decisive conflict between France and England for control of North America. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, would begin in 1756 and end with the complete transformation of the political map of the continent. But before that war began, something remarkable happened that demonstrated just how complex and sophisticated indigenous diplomacy had become. In 1701, representatives of over 30 indigenous nations gathered in Montreal to sign the Great Peace of Montreal, one of the most important treaties in North American history that most people have never heard of. This treaty essentially established a neutrality pact between the major indigenous confederacies and both French and English colonial powers. Indigenous leaders had realized that constantly being drawn into European conflicts was devastating their peoples, and they negotiated an agreement that would theoretically allow them to trade with both sides while fighting for neither. The Great Peace held for over 50 years and demonstrated that indigenous peoples weren't passive victims of European colonization. They were active participants in shaping the political landscape of North America, often more sophisticated in their diplomacy than the Europeans who claimed to be civilizing them. But this carefully balanced system of alliances and neutralities couldn't survive the pressures that were building toward the final showdown between France and England. Both European powers needed indigenous allies too desperately, and the stakes of their conflict were too high for anyone to remain truly neutral. The crisis began in the Ohio River Valley, where French and English territorial claims overlapped and where indigenous peoples were being forced to choose sides, whether they wanted to or not. The French built a chain of forts to secure their claim to the region, while English colonists and land speculators insisted that the territory belonged to them by right of royal charter. In 1754, a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington led an expedition to challenge French control of the region. His attack on a French patrol near present-day Pittsburgh sparked a conflict that would spread around the globe and end with France losing virtually all of its North American empire. But here's what's truly remarkable about this moment. The 7 Years' War wasn't just another colonial conflict. It was the first truly global war in human history, fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines. And the spark that ignited this global conflagration was lit in the forests of what would become Pennsylvania by a 22-year-old colonial militia officer who would later become the first president of the United States. The early years of the war went badly for the English. French forces, led by brilliant commanders like the Marquis de Montcalm, won a series of stunning victories that seemed to prove that New France, despite its small population, could defend itself against English numerical superiority. The capture of Fort William Henry in 1757 was particularly devastating, not just because of the military defeat, but because of the massacre of English prisoners by France's indigenous allies after the surrender. This massacre shocked both sides and demonstrated how the rules of European warfare broke down completely in the North American wilderness. French officers found that they couldn't control their indigenous allies once blood was spilled, while English colonists became convinced that the French were deliberately encouraging atrocities against civilians. But the tide began to turn in 1758 when William Pitt became the effective leader of the British war effort. Pitt understood something that previous British leaders had missed. North America was worth whatever it cost to win. He poured unprecedented resources into the North American theatre, sending regular British troops, modern artillery, and experienced commanders to support colonial forces. The Siege of Louisbourg in 1758 demonstrated the effectiveness of this new British strategy. Instead of relying on colonial militia, the British sent a professional army with proper siege equipment and naval support. The fortress that had seemed impregnable fell after a 2-month siege, cutting off French reinforcements and supplies to the interior of New France. But the most crucial battle of the war took place on September 13, 1759, on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City. This battle lasted less than 30 minutes, but its consequences shaped the next 2.5 centuries of Canadian history. The British commander, James Wolfe, had spent the summer of 1759 trying unsuccessfully to capture Quebec. The city sat on cliffs high above the St. Lawrence River and seemed impossible to assault directly. But Wolfe discovered a narrow path up the cliffs that the French had left lightly guarded, believing it was too steep for an army to climb. On the night of September 12th, British troops climbed this path in darkness and formed up for battle on the Plains of Abraham, the flat ground just outside Quebec's walls. When the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, discovered British troops deployed for battle where no enemy should have been able to reach, he made a fatal decision. Instead of waiting for reinforcements or retreating behind Quebec's fortifications, he immediately attacked with the forces he had available. The battle that followed was a classic European-style engagement, the kind of warfare that heavily favoured British discipline and firepower. The French attack broke against British volleys, Montcalm was mortally wounded, and Quebec fell within days. Both Wolfe and Montcalm died in the battle, making them tragic heroes for their respective sides, but the British victory was decisive. The fall of Quebec effectively ended New France as a political entity, though Montreal held out for another year, and French forces continued to hope that European diplomacy might restore their North American empire. But when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, France ceded virtually all of its North American territories to Britain, keeping only the tiny islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon off the coast of Newfoundland. The British now controlled virtually all of eastern North America, from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. But controlling this vast territory and governing its diverse populations would prove to be far more challenging than conquering it had been. The British faced an immediate crisis. What to do with the roughly 60,000 French-speaking Catholics who now found themselves British subjects? These weren't just scattered individuals who could be easily assimilated. They were a coherent society with their own language, religion, legal system, and cultural traditions. They had been enemies of Britain for over a century, and many British officials wanted to suppress their culture and force them to become Protestant English speakers. But British officials in North America quickly realized that this approach would be both impractical and dangerous. The French population of Quebec was concentrated in a strategically vital region along the St. Lawrence River. Alienating them would create a permanent source of instability in the heart of British North America, especially since France might try to reclaim its former colony in a future war. The solution was the Quebec Act of 1774, one of the most important and controversial pieces of legislation in Canadian history. This act essentially allowed French Canadians to keep their language, religion, and legal system, while accepting British political control. It was a pragmatic compromise that prevented rebellion in Quebec, but it enraged English-speaking colonists to the south, who saw it as a betrayal of Protestant and English principles. The Quebec Act was actually one of the causes of the American Revolution. English colonists in Massachusetts and Virginia couldn't understand why Britain was coddling Catholic French speakers while imposing new taxes and restrictions on loyal English-speaking Protestants. The Act seemed to prove that Britain valued its new Catholic subjects more than its old Protestant ones. But here's the irony. The Quebec Act, which helped trigger the American Revolution, also ensured that Quebec would remain loyal to Britain when that revolution began. French Canadians had no reason to join a rebellion led by English-speaking Protestants who had spent decades demanding that Britain suppress French Catholic culture. When the American Revolution began in 1775, it immediately became a struggle for the future of all of North America, not just the 13 rebelling colonies. American revolutionary leaders knew that they needed to prevent Britain from using its remaining North American territories as bases for military operations against the rebellion. The Americans launched 2 major invasions of what would become Canada during the Revolutionary War. The first, in 1775, captured Montreal and besieged Quebec City through the brutal winter of 1775-76. For a few months, it seemed possible that the entire former territory of New France might join the American rebellion. But the siege of Quebec failed, partly because of determined British and French Canadian resistance, and partly because American forces couldn't maintain themselves through a Canadian winter without local support. When British reinforcements arrived in the spring of 1776, American forces retreated in chaos, leaving behind their sick and wounded and most of their equipment. The Second American Invasion, in 1777, was part of a larger British strategy to split the rebellion by controlling the Hudson River Valley and isolating New England from the other rebelling colonies. But this invasion also failed, ending with the surrender of British General John Burgoyne's entire army at Saratoga, a defeat that convinced France to enter the war on the American side. These failed invasions had profound consequences for the future of Canada. They demonstrated that the remaining British territories in North America could defend themselves against American attack, and they convinced many inhabitants of these territories that their future lay with Britain rather than with the new American Republic. More importantly, the American Revolution created the first large wave of English-speaking immigration to what would become Canada. As the war progressed and American independence became increasingly likely, thousands of Americans who had remained loyal to Britain began fleeing north to British territory. These United Empire Loyalists, as they came to be known, weren't just fleeing persecution. Many of them had their property confiscated, their businesses destroyed, and their lives threatened because of their political beliefs. They arrived in British North America as refugees, but they brought with them skills, capital, and a fierce determination to build a society that would be both North American and British. The Loyalist migration transformed British North America in ways that nobody could have predicted. Before the Revolution, the non-Indigenous population of what would become Canada was overwhelmingly French-speaking and Catholic. After the Revolution, there were substantial English-speaking Protestant populations in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and what would become Ontario. These new English-speaking settlers didn't just want to live under French law and Catholic institutions. They demanded their own representative assemblies, their own Protestant churches, and their own English legal system. But they also didn't want to create a replica of the American Republic they had fled. They wanted something different, a society that combined British political traditions with North American conditions. The result was a series of constitutional arrangements that created the basic structure of what would eventually become Canada. The Constitutional Act of 1791 divided Quebec into 2 separate colonies: Lower Canada, which remained predominantly French-speaking and Catholic, and Upper Canada, which became predominantly English-speaking and Protestant. Each colony got its own elected assembly, but both remained firmly under British control through appointed governors and appointed upper houses. This system was designed to provide enough democracy to satisfy English-speaking settlers while maintaining enough British authority to prevent another American-style rebellion. But this constitutional compromise also created new problems. The division between Upper and Lower Canada institutionalized the ethnic and religious differences that would dominate Canadian politics for the next century. It created 2 separate societies that shared the same continent, but had very different languages, religions, and political traditions. Meanwhile, the maritime colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island were developing their own distinct identities. Halifax had become a major British naval base, the key to British control of the North Atlantic. The Bay of Fundy had attracted loyalist settlers who were creating prosperous farming communities. The fishing industry was providing the foundation for dozens of small coastal towns that lived by harvesting the incredibly rich marine resources of the North Atlantic. But all of these British North American colonies remained small, scattered, and vulnerable. Upper Canada had fewer than 100,000 inhabitants. Lower Canada had perhaps 300,000. The maritime colonies had even smaller populations. Together, all of British North America had fewer people than the single American state of Virginia. This small population was scattered across an enormous territory with virtually no transportation infrastructure connecting the different regions. A letter from Halifax to York, the capital of Upper Canada, could take weeks to arrive. Trade between the colonies was minimal. Most colonists identified more strongly with their local region than with any larger British North American identity. And looming to the south was the rapidly growing American Republic, whose population was approaching 10 million by 1820. American settlers were pushing westward across the continent at an unprecedented pace, and many Americans believed that it was their nation's manifest destiny to control all of North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The War of 1812 would test whether the scattered British colonies could survive American expansion, or whether they would be absorbed into the growing American empire like so many other territories had been. This war would forge the first real sense of Canadian identity and prove that these northern colonies were determined to chart their own course in North America. The War of 1812 began as an American attempt to finish what the Revolution had started. American politicians openly declared that conquering British North America would be nothing more than a mere matter of marching. They looked at the scattered, sparsely populated British colonies and saw easy pickings. Former President Thomas Jefferson confidently predicted that the acquisition of Canada would be accomplished in a single campaign season. But the Americans had fundamentally misunderstood what they were up against. These weren't reluctant British subjects waiting to be liberated. These were people who had already chosen sides, often at enormous personal cost. The United Empire Loyalists hadn't fled to British North America because they loved King George III. They had come because they believed in a different vision of what North America could become. The war began with American invasions at 3 separate points along the border, each designed to quickly overwhelm British defences before they could be reinforced from overseas. The strategy looked brilliant on paper. In reality, it was a disaster from the very beginning. The 1st American Army, led by General William Hull, invaded Upper Canada near Detroit with overwhelming numerical superiority. Hull had over 2,000 troops against a British force of barely 800. Victory seemed inevitable. Instead, Hull found himself facing Isaac Brock, a British general who understood that in frontier warfare, boldness often mattered more than numbers. Brock convinced his Indigenous ally Tecumseh to make the American army think they were facing thousands of warriors instead of hundreds. Hull, terrified of a massacre like the ones that had traumatized American settlers during the Revolution, surrendered Detroit without firing a shot. An entire American army, along with all its supplies and equipment, fell into British hands without a battle. The second American invasion targeted the Niagara frontier, where the geography seemed to favor the attackers. American forces successfully crossed the Niagara River and captured Queenston Heights, a strategic position that controlled access to the entire peninsula. For a few hours it looked like Upper Canada might be cut in two. But then Isaac Brock arrived with British reinforcements, determined to retake the Heights or die trying. He died trying. A single American sniper's bullet killed the British commander as he led a charge up the Heights, but his death galvanized rather than demoralized the British and Canadian defenders. By the end of the day, the Americans had been driven back across the river, leaving behind hundreds of prisoners and another humiliating defeat. The third American invasion targeted Montreal, the key to British control of the St. Lawrence River system. This attack should have succeeded. American forces vastly outnumbered the British defenders, and Montreal was virtually impossible to reinforce during the winter months. But the American commander Henry Dearborn called off the invasion after a minor skirmish convinced him that British resistance would be too strong. 3 invasions, 3 failures. American confidence in easy conquest evaporated, replaced by a growing realization that conquering British North America would require a long, expensive, and uncertain war. But the real story of 1812 wasn't being written by professional armies and famous generals. It was being written by ordinary colonists who discovered that they were willing to fight and die for something they had barely understood before the war began. Upper Canada's militia was largely composed of recent American immigrants who legally were still American citizens. These men faced an agonizing choice: fight for the country they had left, or fight for the country that had given them new homes. Most chose to fight for their new homes, and their choice created something unprecedented in North American history. For the first time, people who had been born in different countries, who spoke different languages, who practiced different religions, found themselves fighting side by side for a common cause. English-speaking loyalists fought alongside French-speaking habitants. Recent immigrants from Scotland fought alongside Indigenous warriors. Protestant farmers fought alongside Catholic priests. The war created heroes who became legends, like Laura Secord, who walked 20 miles through enemy territory to warn British forces of an impending American attack. It created villains like the American raiders who burned York, the capital of Upper Canada, destroying the colonial parliament buildings and terrorizing civilians. But most importantly, the war created a shared experience of survival against overwhelming odds. When American forces burned the tiny capital of York, colonists throughout British North America realized that this wasn't just a military conflict. This was a war for their very existence as distinct societies. The turning point came in 1813, when British naval forces finally gained control of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. American strategy had depended on controlling these inland waterways to supply their armies and cut off British reinforcements. Once the British regained naval superiority, American forces found themselves trapped in hostile territory, unable to advance or retreat effectively. The Battle of Lake Erie was fought entirely between warships built on the shores of the lakes from trees that had been growing just months before. Both sides were literally constructing navies from scratch, racing to build enough ships to control these crucial waterways. When British ships finally defeated the American fleet, they didn't just win a naval battle. They ensured that British North America would survive as something separate from the American Republic. But the war's most famous battle was fought after the peace treaty had already been signed. The Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson's forces decisively defeated a British army, became an American legend that helped propel Jackson to the presidency. Americans remembered New Orleans as proof that they had won the War of 1812. But in British North America, people remembered different battles. They remembered Queenston Heights, where Isaac Brock died defending Upper Canada. They remembered Chateauguay, where a small force of French-Canadian militia stopped an American army 10 times their size. They remembered Chrysler's Farm, where British regulars and Canadian militia working together defeated a much larger American force. These victories created something that hadn't existed before 1812, a sense that British North America could defend itself, that it didn't need to choose between absorption into the American Republic or perpetual dependence on British protection. The colonists had proven to themselves that they could fight for their own survival and win. The peace treaty signed at Ghent in 1814 essentially restored the pre-war boundaries, leading some historians to call the War of 1812 a pointless conflict that accomplished nothing. But this misses the most important consequence of the war. It established that there would be 2 different nations in North America, not one. Before 1812, many people assumed that the American Republic would eventually absorb all of North America simply through population growth and economic expansion. After 1812, it was clear that the British North American colonies intended to remain separate, and that they had the will and ability to defend that separation. The post-war period saw an explosion of immigration that transformed British North America from a collection of frontier settlements into genuine colonial societies. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe had left millions of people displaced and looking for new opportunities. British North America, having proven its stability during the War of 1812, attracted hundreds of thousands of these immigrants. Scottish Highlanders, cleared from their ancestral lands by sheep farming, settled in Nova Scotia and Upper Canada. Irish Catholics fleeing poverty and discrimination found new homes in New Brunswick and Lower Canada. English agricultural workers, displaced by industrial changes, sought opportunity in the forests and farms of the colonial frontier. This immigration boom created the first real cities in British North America. Montreal grew from a fur trading post into a commercial centre with banks, newspapers, and manufacturing. Toronto, rebuilt after being burned by American raiders, became a bustling provincial capital. Halifax developed into one of the most important ports on the North Atlantic, but this rapid growth also created new tensions. The existing French-speaking population of Lower Canada watched nervously as English-speaking immigrants poured into their province, threatening to make them a minority in their own homeland. The family compact that controlled Upper Canada's government seemed determined to prevent democratic reform. The maritime colonies struggled with economic dependence on British markets and British military spending. These tensions exploded in 1837 with rebellions in both Upper and Lower Canada. The rebels weren't trying to join the United States, as American revolutionaries had done 60 years earlier. They were trying to create more democratic and responsive governments within the British system. Louis-Joseph Papineau led the rebellion in Lower Canada, demanding that the French-speaking majority be allowed to control their own affairs without interference from British-appointed governors who couldn't even speak French. His followers weren't separatists or Republicans. They were Canadian patriots who believed that British constitutional principles should apply to colonial societies as much as to the mother country. William Lyon Mackenzie led the rebellion in Upper Canada, demanding an end to the family compact's monopoly on political power and economic opportunity. His followers weren't anti-British radicals. They were farmers and merchants who believed that British North America should enjoy the same democratic rights that existed in Britain itself. Both rebellions failed militarily, but they succeeded in forcing the British government to reconsider how it governed its North American colonies. The Durham Report, commissioned to investigate the causes of the rebellions, recommended something unprecedented in the history of European colonialism: responsible government, where colonial assemblies would control their own internal affairs while remaining part of the British Empire. This recommendation led to the Act of Union in 1840, which reunited Upper and Lower Canada into a single province of Canada with an elected assembly that could control most aspects of colonial government. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, but it established the principle that British North Americans could govern themselves without breaking their connection to Britain. The 1840s and 1850s saw British North America transformed from a collection of struggling frontier colonies into prosperous, self-confident societies that were beginning to think of themselves as something more than just overseas extensions of Britain. The economy diversified beyond fur trading and subsistence agriculture. Railways began connecting the scattered settlements. Telegraph lines carried news and commercial information at unprecedented speed. But the most important development was demographic. By 1850, the combined population of British North America had reached nearly 2.5 million people. This was still much smaller than the American population of over 23 million, but it was large enough to sustain genuine urban centres, sophisticated institutions, and complex political debates about the future of these societies. The question that dominated those political debates was simple in concept but incredibly complex in practice. What should British North America become? Should the colonies remain separate, each developing its own identity and institutions? Should they unite into some kind of federation that could speak with one voice while preserving local autonomy? Should they seek closer integration with Britain? Or should they prepare for eventual independence? The American Civil War, which began in 1861, forced British North Americans to confront these questions with new urgency. The war demonstrated that even the most successful democratic republic could tear itself apart over fundamental disagreements about the nature of society. It also showed that modern warfare could devastate entire regions and kill hundreds of thousands of people in just a few years. British North Americans watched the American Civil War with a mixture of horror and fascination. Many sympathized with the Union cause and opposed slavery, but they also worried about what would happen when the war ended. Would a victorious Union turn its massive armies northward to complete the conquest that had failed in 1812? Would British North America be able to defend itself against a battle-hardened American military that had just proven it could mobilize millions of soldiers? These fears weren't paranoid fantasies. Many American politicians and newspapers openly discussed annexing British North America as compensation for British support of the Confederacy during the Civil War. The Fenian raids of the 1860s, where Irish-American veterans of the Civil War invaded Canada, hoping to pressure Britain into granting Irish independence, showed that American military power could easily cross the border when it chose to do so. The solution to these security concerns became the driving force behind Canadian Confederation. If the British North American colonies remained separate, each would be vulnerable to American pressure or attack. But if they united into a single federation, they might have enough population, resources, and military capacity to maintain their independence in North America. The path to Confederation wasn't smooth or inevitable. The maritime colonies worried about being dominated by the much larger populations of Upper and Lower Canada. French Canadians feared that federation would submerge their distinct society in an English-speaking majority. Upper Canadians resented being tied to Lower Canadian politicians who seemed to block every reform proposal. But a remarkable group of political leaders emerged who were able to craft compromises that addressed these concerns while creating something genuinely new in the history of democratic government. Georges-Étienne Cartier convinced French Canadians that federation would actually protect their language and culture better than the existing union with Upper Canada. John A. Macdonald convinced English-speaking colonists that a strong federal government could build the railways and develop the resources needed to compete with the United States. The British North America Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1867, created the Dominion of Canada by uniting the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. This wasn't just an administrative reorganization. It was the birth of a new nation, one that would be British in its political traditions, but North American in its geography and culture. The new Dominion faced immediate challenges that would have overwhelmed most new countries. The maritime provinces had joined Confederation reluctantly and were already having second thoughts. The Red River Colony, populated largely by French-speaking Métis, was being transferred from the Hudson's Bay Company to Canadian control, without anyone asking what the inhabitants wanted. The Pacific colonies of British Columbia and Vancouver Island remained separate and were being courted by the United States. But the most daunting challenge was geographical. The new Dominion stretched across half a continent, but it had no way to connect its Atlantic and Pacific regions except through American territory. If Canada was going to survive as a transcontinental nation, it would need to build a railway across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The promise to build a transcontinental railway was what convinced British Columbia to join Confederation in 1871, but actually fulfilling that promise nearly bankrupted the new country and triggered the first major political scandal in Canadian history. The Canadian Pacific Railway became both a symbol of Canadian ambition and a demonstration of what could be accomplished when a small nation committed itself to an apparently impossible goal. The railway took 14 years to build, cost far more than anyone had estimated, and required importing thousands of Chinese workers who laboured under conditions that killed many of them. But when the last spike was driven at Craigellachie, British Columbia, on November 7, 1885, Canada had achieved something that most observers had thought impossible. It had created a transportation link that made it a truly transcontinental nation. The completion of the CPR coincided with another defining moment in early Canadian history, the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. Louis Riel, who had led the Red River Resistance 15 years earlier, returned from exile to lead the Métis people of Saskatchewan in what they saw as a defensive war against Canadian encroachment on their traditional lands and way of life. The rebellion lasted only a few months and ended with Riel's capture, trial, and execution. But it exposed fundamental tensions in Canadian society that persist to this day. French Canadians saw Riel as a martyr who died defending minority rights against English Canadian oppression. English Canadians saw him as a traitor who had committed treason against the Crown. Indigenous peoples saw the rebellion's defeat as proof that the Canadian government would use whatever force was necessary to impose its will on anyone who resisted. But the rebellion also demonstrated something remarkable. The new transcontinental railway allowed the Canadian government to transport troops from eastern Canada to the western frontier in just days rather than months. For the first time in Canadian history, the federal government could project military power across the entire width of the continent. By 1890, just 23 years after Confederation, Canada had become something that would have seemed impossible in 1867, a transcontinental nation that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific with a population approaching 5 million people, a growing industrial economy, and political institutions that were proving capable of managing the complex challenges of governing such a vast and diverse country. But Canada's greatest challenges still lay ahead. The country that had been created through political compromise and railway construction would soon face tests that would determine whether it could survive as a unified nation or whether the forces of regionalism, ethnic conflict, and external pressure would tear it apart. The 20th century would bring 2 world wars that would transform Canada from a British colony into an independent nation. It would bring economic booms and devastating depressions. It would bring waves of immigration that would make Canada one of the most multicultural societies on earth. It would bring the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, the October Crisis, and the constitutional battles that would define modern Canadian federalism. But all of these future developments would build on the foundations that had been laid in the first century after Confederation. The principle that Canada could be both British and North American, both unified and diverse, both connected to the wider world and distinctly Canadian. The story of how those foundations were tested and strengthened, how Canada evolved from a small colonial federation into a modern nation that would play important roles on the world stage, how it would survive 2 world wars and emerge as a middle power with global influence. That story would define the next chapter of Canadian history, one that would prove that the fragile experiment begun in 1867 was capable of becoming something far greater than its founders had ever dared to imagine. The turn of the 20th century found Canada standing at a crossroads that would define its character for generations to come. This wasn't just another decade of gradual change. This was the moment when Canada would either remain a quiet collection of provinces on the margins of world events, or step forward as a nation capable of shaping history itself. And here's what makes this period absolutely fascinating. Most Canadians had no idea they were about to become players on the world stage. They were focused on local concerns, regional politics, and the day-to-day business of building lives in a country that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. But forces were already in motion that would thrust this young nation into conflicts and decisions that would echo through the next century. The man at the centre of this transformation was Wilfrid Laurier, Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister. who took office in 1896 with a vision that seemed almost impossibly ambitious. Laurier didn't just want Canada to prosper, he wanted it to become great. He famously declared that the 20th century would belong to Canada, and he set about making that prediction come true with policies that were both brilliant and controversial. Laurier's strategy was elegantly simple. Fill the empty West with immigrants, connect the scattered regions with new railways, and position Canada as the bridge between Britain and America in an increasingly interconnected world. But executing this strategy would require navigating some of the most complex political and cultural challenges any democratic leader had ever faced. The immigration boom that Laurier unleashed was unprecedented in Canadian history. His government actively recruited settlers from across Europe, promising them free land and new opportunities in the Canadian West. But this wasn't just about finding people to farm the prairies. This was about creating a Canadian identity that could absorb massive cultural diversity while maintaining national unity. Between 1896 and 1911, over 2 million immigrants poured into Canada. They came from Ukraine, Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, Italy, and dozens of other countries. Many spoke no English or French. Most had never experienced democratic government. All of them were looking for something they couldn't find in their home countries: the chance to own land, practice their religion freely, and build better lives for their children. The result was something that had never been attempted before in human history: the deliberate creation of a multicultural society on a continental scale. Prairie towns that hadn't existed 5 years earlier suddenly had populations speaking 10 different languages. Farming communities developed where Lutheran churches stood next to Orthodox cathedrals, where Ukrainian dance halls operated alongside German beer gardens, where children played games that mixed traditions from across Europe. But here's what makes this period so remarkable: it actually worked. Despite predictions that Canada would fragment into ethnic enclaves that couldn't communicate with each other, these diverse communities began developing a shared Canadian identity surprisingly quickly. The harsh realities of prairie life created bonds that transcended ethnic and religious differences. When your neighbour's barn burned down, you helped rebuild it regardless of what language they spoke at home. The key was the Dominion Lands Act, which offered 160 acres of free land to any male settler willing to live on it for 3 years and bring a portion under cultivation. This policy created what historians call the homestead mentality, the idea that success in Canada depended on hard work, community cooperation, and adaptation to local conditions, rather than on inherited status or ethnic background. Yet this massive immigration also created tensions that threatened to tear the country apart. Protestant English Canadians worried that Catholic immigrants from Eastern Europe would never assimilate into British traditions. French Canadians feared that their language and culture would be overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of new arrivals. Indigenous peoples watched helplessly as their traditional territories were carved up and distributed to strangers who had never heard of treaty obligations. The school question became the flashpoint for these tensions. Manitoba had eliminated French language education and Catholic schools, sparking a crisis that threatened to split the country along religious and linguistic lines. Laurier's solution was characteristically Canadian, a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, but prevented the country from breaking apart. French Catholics got some protections. English Protestants maintained their dominance, and the country lurched forward with its unity intact, but strained. Meanwhile, the economy was transforming at breathtaking speed. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway had opened the West to settlement, but now Laurier's government was sponsoring 2 additional transcontinental railways. The Grand Trunk Pacific and the Canadian Northern were supposed to compete with the CPR and ensure that no single company could control access to Western resources. This railway boom created one of the great speculative bubbles in Canadian history. Towns sprang up wherever railways were planned to run. Land values soared. investors poured money into everything from grain elevators to lumber mills to mining operations. For a few years, it seemed like Canada really might become the economic powerhouse that Laurier had promised. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1898 added another layer of excitement and possibility to this period of explosive growth. When gold was discovered in the Yukon Territory, tens of thousands of prospectors flooded north through Canadian territory, creating instant cities like Dawson and establishing Canadian sovereignty over vast northern regions that might otherwise have been claimed by the United States. But the gold rush also revealed something important about Canadian character. While American prospectors focused on getting rich quick and getting out, Canadian authorities insisted on maintaining law and order even in the most remote mining camps. The Northwest Mounted Police became legendary for their ability to keep peace in situations that had produced chaos and violence in other frontier regions. This period also saw Canada beginning to assert itself on the international stage in ways that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. When Britain became involved in the Boer War in South Africa, Laurier faced enormous pressure to send Canadian troops to support the imperial cause. English Canadians demanded that Canada prove its loyalty to the Empire. French Canadians asked why they should fight for British imperialism in Africa. Laurier's solution was another masterpiece of Canadian compromise. Canada would send volunteers to fight in South Africa, but they would serve in distinctly Canadian units under Canadian officers, and the Canadian government would pay for their equipment and transport. This established the principle that Canada could support imperial causes while maintaining its own identity and decision-making authority. The 7,000 Canadians who served in South Africa returned home with a new sense of national pride and military competence. They had proven that Canadian soldiers could fight effectively alongside British regulars. More importantly, they had done so as Canadians, not as colonial auxiliaries. The Boer War marked Canada's first steps toward becoming an independent military power. But all of this growth and expansion came at enormous cost. The railway boom that was supposed to open the West to development instead nearly bankrupted the federal government. Both the Grand Trunk Pacific and the Canadian Northern ran into financial difficulties that required massive government bailouts. By 1915, the government would be forced to nationalise these failed railways, creating Canadian National Railways and establishing the principle of public ownership in transportation that would define Canadian economic policy for decades. The immigration boom that was supposed to create prosperity instead created regional tensions that threatened national unity. Western farmers felt exploited by Eastern manufacturers who controlled both prices and transportation. Maritime provinces felt ignored by a federal government that seemed obsessed with Western development. Quebec felt threatened by the massive influx of English-speaking immigrants who were changing the demographic balance of the country. These tensions exploded during the naval crisis of 1909-1911, when Britain requested Canadian support for an expanded Royal Navy to counter growing German naval power. English Canadians wanted Canada to contribute money for British dreadnought battleships. French Canadians wanted Canada to build its own navy that would serve Canadian interests. Western farmers didn't want to pay for any navy at all. Laurier proposed a compromise. Canada would build its own small navy that could serve alongside British forces in wartime but remain under Canadian control during peace. This satisfied almost nobody. English Canadians thought it was too little, too late. French Canadians thought it was a trick to draw Canada into British wars. The Conservative opposition denounced it as a tin-pot navy that would be useless in a real conflict. The naval issue became the central question in the 1911 federal election, but it was overshadowed by an even more controversial proposal: reciprocity with the United States. Laurier had negotiated a trade agreement that would eliminate tariffs on many goods moving between Canada and the United States. Western farmers loved the idea because it would give them access to American markets for their grain. Eastern manufacturers hated it because it would force them to compete with more efficient American factories. The reciprocity debate revealed fundamental disagreements about what kind of country Canada should become. Supporters argued that free trade with the United States would bring prosperity and closer ties with Canada's natural North American partner. Opponents argued that it would lead to economic dependence and eventual political absorption into the United States. Conservative leader Robert Borden skillfully exploited these fears, arguing that reciprocity was the first step toward annexation. His campaign used slogans like "No truck" or "Trade with the Yankees," and warned that free trade would destroy Canadian industry and Canadian independence. When prominent Americans made speeches supporting reciprocity because it would bind Canada more closely to the United States, they inadvertently provided ammunition for Canadian opponents. The 1911 election was one of the most bitter and divisive in Canadian history. Laurier, who had dominated Canadian politics for 15 years, went down to crushing defeat. Borden's Conservatives won a solid majority by promising to maintain Canadian independence through protective tariffs and imperial connection rather than continental integration. But the new Conservative government inherited all the problems that had defeated Laurier, plus some new ones that would prove even more challenging. The railway boom had collapsed, leaving the government with enormous debts and 2 bankrupt railway companies. Immigration was slowing as economic opportunities in the West diminished. Regional tensions were getting worse rather than better. And looming over everything was the growing crisis in Europe, where the alliance system that had kept peace since 1871 was breaking down under the pressure of competing nationalisms, imperial rivalries, and an arms race that seemed to have no end. Most Canadians were too focused on domestic issues to pay much attention to European politics, but they were about to discover that Canada's fate was tied to world events, whether they wanted it to be or not. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, set in motion a series of events that would transform Canada more profoundly than anything that had happened since Confederation. Within 6 weeks, all the major powers of Europe were at war, and Canada found itself automatically involved because of its status as part of the British Empire. But here's what made Canada's entry into World War I so significant. While the country was legally committed to war because of Britain's declaration, the Canadian government and Canadian people had to decide for themselves what kind of war effort they would make. This wasn't just about following British orders. This was about defining what it meant to be Canadian in a world crisis. Prime Minister Borden's initial response was cautiously supportive. Canada would do its part for the Empire, but that part would be limited and carefully controlled. The government authorized an expeditionary force of 25,000 men, a contribution that seemed substantial for a country of 8 million people, but hardly decisive in a war involving millions of soldiers. Nobody expected the war to last more than a few months. Military experts on both sides predicted that modern industrial warfare would be too expensive and too destructive to continue for long. The Canadian Expeditionary Force was organized as a short-term measure to help Britain and France achieve quick victory over Germany and Austria-Hungary. The reality was horrifically different. The Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914 destroyed the French army's offensive capacity. The German advance was stopped just short of Paris, but only after both sides had suffered casualties on a scale that nobody had thought possible. By October, the Western Front had stabilized into a line of trenches that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. This wasn't the kind of war that anybody had planned for. Instead of rapid movement and decisive battles, it became a grinding war of attrition, where armies measured success in yards, gained at costs of thousands of lives. Machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery made frontal attacks suicidal, but military commanders on both sides continued ordering them because nobody knew what else to do. The first Canadian troops arrived in Britain in October 1914, but they weren't ready for combat until the spring of 1915. Their first major engagement was the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. where they encountered something that changed the nature of warfare forever: poison gas. The Germans released chlorine gas along a 4-mile front, creating a yellow-green cloud that drifted toward Allied trenches with the evening breeze. Soldiers who had never seen chemical weapons had no idea what was happening to them. Those who breathed the gas died in agony, their lungs destroyed by chlorine. Those who survived fled in panic, leaving a gap in the Allied line that threatened to break the entire front. But the Canadians held. Despite having no gas masks and no training for chemical warfare, Canadian soldiers improvised protection by urinating on handkerchiefs and holding them over their faces. The ammonia in urine provided some neutralization of the chlorine gas, allowing Canadian units to maintain their positions while other Allied forces regrouped. The Battle of Ypres made the Canadian Corps famous throughout the British Empire. They had faced a new and terrifying weapon and refused to break. But the battle also introduced Canadians to the reality of modern warfare. In 4 days of fighting, the Canadian Corps suffered over 6,000 casualties, including 2,000 deaths. These losses shocked Canada in ways that are difficult to understand today. The country had never experienced military casualties on this scale. Entire communities lost most of their young men in a single battle. Families that had sent sons off to what they thought would be a brief adventure found themselves mourning dead heroes they would never see again. But instead of reducing Canadian commitment to the war, these casualties increased it. The deaths at Ypres created a sense that Canada had paid too high a price to quit now. The sacrifice had to mean something, and the only way to give it meaning was to continue fighting until victory was achieved. This logic would drive Canadian war policy for the next 3 years, turning what had begun as a limited commitment into a national obsession that would transform Canadian society in ways that nobody could have predicted. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914 would continue until November 1918, and by the time it ended, Canada would be a completely different country. The expansion of the Canadian war effort was gradual but relentless. The original commitment of 25,000 men grew to 50,000, then 100,000, then 250,000, then 500,000. By 1917, Canada was maintaining 4 full divisions on the Western Front, plus additional forces in other theatres, a military commitment that was enormous for a country of 8 million people. This expansion required mobilizing Canadian society in ways that had never been attempted before. The government had to find, train, and equip hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It had to build the factories and supply chains needed to support modern warfare. It had to manage an economy that was simultaneously losing workers to military service and expanding production to meet wartime demands. The solution was the emergence of what historians call the warfare state, a form of government that concentrated unprecedented power in the hands of federal authorities and used that power to direct every aspect of national life toward winning the war. The Canadian government took control of railways, regulated food production, directed industrial development, and eventually imposed military conscription, despite fierce political opposition. This transformation wasn't just administrative, it was cultural and psychological. Canadians who had thought of their country as a peaceful agricultural society discovered that they were capable of producing some of the most effective military units in the world. The Canadian Corps developed a reputation for tactical innovation, fighting effectiveness, and ability to accomplish missions that other forces couldn't complete. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917 became the defining moment of Canadian military achievement. Previous British and French attacks on this heavily fortified position had failed with enormous casualties. The Canadian Corps spent months preparing for their assault, using new tactics that emphasized careful planning, intensive training, and coordination between infantry, artillery, and engineers. The attack succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Canadian forces captured the entire ridge in 3 days, taking more ground and more prisoners than any previous Allied offensive on the Western Front. More importantly, They did it as a unified Canadian force, rather than as separate units from different provinces. The 4 Canadian divisions attacked together, fought together, and won together. Vimy Ridge became the moment when Canada truly became a nation in the minds of its people. The victory wasn't just a military success. It was proof that Canadians could accomplish things that the great powers of Europe couldn't manage. The ridge became a symbol of Canadian competence, Canadian unity, and Canadian distinctiveness from both Britain and the United States. But the cost of this military success was staggering. By 1917, Canadian casualties exceeded 150,000, including over 50,000 deaths. These losses were concentrated among young men from small communities, creating demographic disasters in regions that had sent disproportionate numbers of volunteers. Some towns lost virtually their entire generation of military-age males. The human cost of the war was compounded by political crises that threatened to destroy Canadian unity. The most serious was the conscription crisis of 1917, when Prime Minister Borden decided that voluntary enlistment was no longer providing enough soldiers to maintain Canada's military commitments. French Canadians opposed conscription with fierce unanimity. They argued that they had no obligation to die for British imperialism in European wars. They pointed out that the war was being fought to defend democratic principles that didn't seem to apply to French language rights in Canada. They noted that English Canadian business leaders were getting rich from war contracts, while French Canadian farmers were being drafted to die in foreign trenches. English Canadians supported conscription with equal fervour. They argued that Canada's honour was at stake and that everyone had to share the burden of defending democracy against German militarism. They pointed to the casualties that English-speaking units had already suffered and demanded that French Canadians contribute equally to the national effort. The conscription election of 1917 split the country along linguistic lines more clearly than any previous political crisis. Borden's unionist government, supported by English-speaking Liberals who broke with their own party over the issue, won a crushing victory in English-speaking Canada while being virtually shut out in Quebec. The election established patterns of regional and ethnic division that would influence Canadian politics for decades. Quebec voters concluded that the rest of Canada was willing to coerce them into supporting policies they fundamentally opposed. English-speaking Canadians concluded that Quebec was unwilling to share the sacrifices that citizenship required. Yet somehow, the country held together. Conscription was implemented despite violent protests in Quebec City. French Canadian conscripts served alongside English Canadian volunteers. The war effort continued despite domestic political crisis. Canada proved that it could survive even the most divisive internal conflicts while maintaining its external commitments. The war ended on November 11, 1918, with Germany's surrender and the collapse of the Central Powers. Canada had mobilized over 600,000 people in military service, suffered over 200,000 casualties, including 60,000 deaths, and spent over $4 billion on the war effort. These were enormous sacrifices for a small country, but they had purchased something invaluable: recognition as a nation that could stand alongside the great powers of the world. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Canada insisted on signing the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain, establishing the principle that it was an independent nation with its own international personality. Prime Minister Borden fought successfully for Canadian membership in the new League of Nations, making Canada one of the founding members of the first global organization dedicated to maintaining international peace. These diplomatic victories were symbols of a much deeper transformation. The Canada that emerged from World War I was fundamentally different from the Canada that had entered it 5 years earlier. It was more urban, more industrial, more politically centralized, and more internationally engaged. It had proven its military competence, its economic capacity, and its political resilience under the most extreme stress. But the war had also revealed deep fractures in Canadian society that would influence the country's development for generations. The conscription crisis had poisoned relations between French and English Canadians. The expansion of federal power had created resentment in provinces that valued local autonomy. The enormous cost of the war effort had created debt burdens that would constrain government policy for decades. Most importantly, the war had established Canada as a middle power with global responsibilities and global interests. The country could no longer pretend to be an isolated North American society concerned only with domestic development. It was now a player on the world stage, with all the opportunities and obligations that status entailed. The 1920s would test whether Canada could manage this new international role while healing the domestic wounds that the war had created. It would be a decade of economic prosperity and cultural flowering, but also of political instability and social tension that would set the stage for even greater challenges in the decades ahead. The decade that followed would reveal whether this transformed nation could live up to the promise of its wartime achievements, or whether the stresses of peace would prove even more challenging than the trials of war. The 1920s arrived with a sense of possibility that seemed almost intoxicating after 4 years of unprecedented sacrifice and suffering. Picture this: veterans returning home to a country that looked fundamentally different from the one they had left. Cities had grown larger and more industrial. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The federal government had acquired powers and responsibilities that would have been unthinkable before 1914. And perhaps most importantly, Canada had gained something that money couldn't buy and politics couldn't create: respect on the world stage. But here's what makes this period absolutely fascinating. The very success of Canada's war effort created new problems that nobody had anticipated. The country had proven it could mobilize enormous resources and achieve remarkable military victories. But could it translate that same energy and unity into peacetime prosperity? Could a nation that had been held together by external threats maintain its cohesion when those threats disappeared? The answer, as it turned out, was more complicated than anyone expected. The 1920s would be remembered as the Roaring Twenties, a decade of jazz music, economic boom, and cultural revolution that seemed to promise unlimited prosperity and progress. But beneath the surface celebration, fundamental tensions were building that would eventually explode in ways that would test Canadian unity more severely than even the conscription crisis had done. The first challenge was economic. The massive industrial expansion that had powered Canada's war effort didn't simply shut down when peace arrived. Factories that had been producing shells and uniforms had to find new markets for their products. Workers who had been essential to the war effort suddenly found themselves competing for jobs in a peacetime economy that wasn't sure what to do with all the productive capacity that had been created. The result was a boom and bust cycle that would become depressingly familiar to Canadians over the next decade. The immediate post-war period saw explosive economic growth as pent-up consumer demand met expanded industrial capacity. People who had been denied consumer goods during the war went on spending sprees that drove up production and employment. For a brief moment, it seemed like the prosperity that had been promised during the war might actually materialize. But this boom was built on shaky foundations. Much of the consumer spending was financed by debt rather than genuine increases in income. The industrial expansion had been designed for wartime production, not peacetime markets. And most critically, the agricultural sector that still employed the largest number of Canadians was facing a crisis that would define the entire decade. During the war, Canadian farmers had been heroes. They had fed not just Canada, but much of the British Empire, earning enormous profits from grain sales that commanded premium prices in global markets. Prairie wheat fields had become symbols of Canadian abundance and Canadian contribution to Allied victory. Farming communities had used their wartime prosperity to invest in new equipment, expand their operations, and build the kind of substantial homes and community institutions that reflected their confidence in continued success. The collapse came with devastating suddenness. European agriculture recovered from wartime disruption much faster than anyone had predicted. American farmers, who had also expanded production during the war, were competing aggressively for the same export markets that Canadians had come to see as their natural right. Global grain prices plummeted from their wartime highs, leaving Canadian farmers with massive debts, expensive equipment, and crops that weren't worth enough to cover their production costs. This agricultural crisis wasn't just an economic problem. It was a political and cultural earthquake that shattered the assumptions that had guided Canadian development since Confederation. The national policy had been built on the idea that Western farmers would provide a reliable market for Eastern manufactured goods while generating export revenues that would support national development. If farming wasn't profitable, the entire economic logic of Canadian Federation came into question. Western farmers responded with a political revolt that would reshape Canadian politics for generations. They formed new political parties that rejected the traditional liberal-conservative competition and demanded fundamental changes to the economic policies that seemed designed to benefit Eastern manufacturers at the expense of Western producers. The Progressive Party emerged as a powerful force that threatened to break the two-party system that had dominated Canadian politics since Confederation. But the agrarian revolt was about more than economics. It was about democracy, representation, and the kind of society that Canada should become. Prairie farmers had always been suspicious of central Canadian political and economic power. But the post-war crisis convinced them that the federal government was actively hostile to their interests. They demanded not just policy changes, but constitutional reforms that would give Western provinces more control over their own resources and development. This regional rebellion coincided with cultural changes that were equally dramatic and equally controversial. The war had accelerated social trends that had been developing for decades, but the 1920s saw them explode into public consciousness in ways that shocked traditionalists and excited modernists. The most visible change was in the role of women. The war had brought hundreds of thousands of women into the industrial workforce, giving them economic independence and practical experience that made pre-war restrictions seem increasingly absurd. The suffrage movement, which had been gaining strength before 1914, became irresistible after women had proven their capacity for full citizenship through their wartime contributions. By 1920, women had gained the right to vote in federal elections and most provincial elections. More importantly, they had gained a sense of their own capabilities that couldn't be legislated away. Women who had managed factory production lines and organized community war efforts weren't going to accept being told that their proper place was in the kitchen and nursery. They demanded access to higher education, professional careers, and public life on terms of equality with men. This gender revolution was part of a broader cultural transformation that saw traditional authorities and conventional moralities challenged in ways that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. The war had killed so many young men and disrupted so many traditional patterns that survivors felt liberated from old constraints and eager to experiment with new possibilities. Jazz music, imported from the United States but adapted to Canadian sensibilities, became the soundtrack of this cultural rebellion. Dance halls and nightclubs offered spaces where young people could socialize with unprecedented freedom. Fashion changed dramatically, with women adopting shorter skirts, bobbed hair, and makeup that would have scandalized their mothers. Prohibition, which had been adopted as a wartime measure, created a culture of speakeasies and bootlegging that made law-breaking seem glamorous rather than shameful. But perhaps the most significant cultural change was the emergence of mass media that could create shared experiences across the vast distances that had always divided Canadian regions. Radio broadcasting, which began in Canada in 1922, allowed people in Vancouver to hear the same programs as people in Halifax. Movies, most of them produced in Hollywood, but shown in theatres from coast to coast, created common references and shared dreams that transcended local differences. This cultural nationalism was encouraged by the federal government, which recognized that Canada needed something more than political institutions to hold it together. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, established in 1932, was explicitly designed to counter American cultural influence and create distinctly Canadian content that would reinforce national identity. The Canada Council, founded later, would serve similar purposes in supporting Canadian arts and literature. Yet this same period also saw the emergence of separatist movements that threatened to tear the country apart, along the same linguistic and cultural lines that had been exposed during the conscription crisis. French-Canadian intellectuals, led by figures like Abbé Lionel Gros, began arguing that French Canada could only preserve its distinctive culture by achieving some form of political independence from English-dominated Canada. These separatist ideas remained marginal during the 1920s, but they reflected deeper anxieties about the direction of Canadian development that would become increasingly important in later decades. French Canadians had supported Confederation in 1867 because they believed it would protect their language and culture while allowing them to participate in North American prosperity. By the 1920s, many were wondering whether that bargain was still worth maintaining. The economic prosperity of the mid-1920s temporarily masked these political and cultural tensions, but it couldn't resolve them. Canada experienced remarkable growth between 1924 and 1929, with new industries like automobile manufacturing, electrical appliances, and chemical production, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs and generating unprecedented levels of consumer spending. This boom was different from previous periods of Canadian economic growth because it was based on domestic consumption rather than resource exports. For the first time in Canadian history, ordinary families could afford automobiles, radios, household appliances, and other manufactured goods that had previously been luxury items available only to the wealthy. The standard of living rose dramatically, especially in urban areas where industrial wages provided access to consumer goods that were transforming daily life. The automobile revolution was particularly significant because it changed not just how Canadians travelled, but how they lived. Cars made it possible for people to live in suburban communities while working in urban centres, creating new patterns of residential development that would define Canadian cities for the rest of the century. They also made it possible for young people to escape parental supervision in ways that horrified traditionalists and delighted the younger generation. But this consumer prosperity was built on a foundation of speculation and debt that would prove catastrophically unstable. The stock market boom of the late 1920s created paper fortunes that seemed to prove that prosperity could be permanent if only people were smart enough to invest in the right companies at the right time. Ordinary Canadians borrowed money to buy stocks, confident that rising prices would make them wealthy enough to pay back their loans and still have money left over. The crash came on October 29, 1929, when the New York Stock Exchange collapsed in a panic of selling that wiped out billions of dollars in paper wealth in a single day. The immediate impact on Canada was severe, but seemed manageable. Stock prices fell, some investors lost money, and economic growth slowed. But most people expected the downturn to be temporary, like previous recessions that had lasted a year or two before prosperity returned. Instead, the crash of 1929 marked the beginning of the Great Depression, the most severe and prolonged economic collapse in Canadian history. What had seemed like a temporary setback became a decade-long catastrophe that would transform Canadian society, politics, and government in ways that nobody could have anticipated. By 1932, unemployment had reached 27% of the workforce. 1 in 4 Canadian families was receiving some form of government relief. Industrial production had fallen by more than 40% from its 1929 peak. Thousands of businesses had failed, taking with them the jobs and savings of millions of Canadians who had believed that prosperity was their natural right. The human cost of the Depression was staggering in ways that statistics couldn't capture. Families that had been prosperous middle-class citizens found themselves standing in breadlines and applying for relief payments that barely covered the cost of basic food and shelter. Young people who had expected to start careers and families instead found themselves riding freight trains across the country, looking for any work they could find. The prairie provinces were hit particularly hard because the agricultural crisis that had begun in the early 1920s was compounded by the worst drought in recorded history. The Dust Bowl years of the 1930s saw entire farming communities abandoned as topsoil blew away and crops failed year after year. Farmers who had survived low prices couldn't survive no crops at all. But here's what makes the Canadian response to the Depression so remarkable. Instead of fragmenting under this enormous stress, the country began developing new ideas about the role of government and the responsibilities of citizenship that would define Canadian political culture for the rest of the century. The traditional belief that governments should limit themselves to maintaining law and order while leaving economic matters to private enterprise was discredited by the obvious failure of free markets to provide even basic economic security. If capitalism couldn't guarantee that people willing to work could find jobs that paid enough to support their families, then government had to step in to fill the gap. This intellectual revolution began at the provincial level with governments that were forced to deal directly with the human consequences of economic collapse. In Saskatchewan, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation emerged as a political movement that explicitly rejected capitalism in favour of democratic socialism. In Alberta, social credit promised to solve economic problems by reforming the monetary system. In Ontario and Quebec, traditional parties adopted increasingly interventionist policies that would have been considered radical socialism just a decade earlier. The federal government, led by Conservative Prime Minister R.B. Bennett after 1930, initially resisted calls for massive government intervention in the economy. Bennett believed that the Depression was a temporary problem that would solve itself if governments maintained balanced budgets and avoided interfering with natural economic processes. His approach was to provide minimal relief to prevent actual starvation while waiting for private enterprise to restore prosperity. This strategy was politically and morally disastrous. By 1935, Bennett had become one of the most hated political figures in Canadian history, blamed for everything from unemployment to soup kitchens to the camps where single unemployed men were housed under military discipline. The Conservative Party was reduced to a rump of 40 seats in the 1935 election, one of the worst defeats in Canadian political history. The Liberal victory in 1935 brought Mackenzie King back to power with a mandate to do something about the Depression, but without a clear plan for what that something should be. King was a cautious politician who preferred gradual reform to dramatic innovation. But the severity of the crisis forced him to experiment with government programs that expanded federal power in unprecedented ways. The most significant innovation was unemployment insurance, a program that pooled risks across the entire national economy to provide income security for workers who lost their jobs through no fault of their own. This required a constitutional amendment because social policy had traditionally been a provincial responsibility, but the provinces were willing to transfer this power to the federal government because they couldn't afford to operate such programs on their own. Unemployment insurance was more than just a social program. It was a statement about the kind of society that Canada wanted to become. Instead of treating unemployment as a personal failure that individuals had to solve for themselves, it treated job loss as a social risk that the entire community had a responsibility to address. This principle would become the foundation for the welfare state that would define post-war Canadian politics. But the most important change during the Depression wasn't any particular government program. It was the emergence of a new understanding of Canadian federalism that would reshape the relationship between federal and provincial governments for the rest of the century. The Rowell-Sirois Commission, appointed in 1937 to study federal-provincial relations, concluded that the division of powers established in 1867 was no longer adequate for the economic and social realities of the 20th century. The Commission recommended that the federal government assume responsibility for unemployment insurance and other social programs, while taking over provincial debts and providing equalization payments to ensure that all Canadians had access to comparable levels of government services, regardless of which province they lived in. These recommendations were controversial and would take decades to implement fully, but they established the intellectual framework for modern Canadian federalism. By the late 1930s, Canada was slowly recovering from the worst effects of the Depression, but the recovery was fragile and incomplete. Unemployment remained high, business investment was still below pre-crash levels, and regional disparities had actually increased during the decade of economic hardship. Many Canadians wondered whether their country would ever again experience the prosperity and confidence that had characterized the 1920s. The answer came from an unexpected source: the growing crisis in Europe, where Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany was preparing for a war that would dwarf even the Great War in its scope and devastation. Most Canadians hoped that they could avoid involvement in another European conflict, but by 1939 it was becoming clear that the choice might not be theirs to make. The declaration of war against Germany on September 10, 1939, marked a turning point not just in Canadian history, but in world history. This time, Canada made its own decision to go to war, consulting with Britain, but not waiting for British direction. Prime Minister King announced that Parliament would decide Canada's role in the conflict, establishing the principle that Canada was now fully sovereign in its foreign policy decisions. But this legal independence came with moral responsibilities that would test Canadian society even more severely than the previous war had done. The Nazi regime represented something qualitatively different from the German Empire that Canada had fought from 1914 to 1918. This wasn't just another imperial conflict or balance of power struggle. This was a war between fundamentally different visions of human civilization itself. The Holocaust, which was still largely unknown to the general public in 1939, would eventually reveal the full horror of what Nazi ideology meant in practice. But even in the early years of the war, it was clear that Hitler's Germany represented a threat to democratic values and human dignity that couldn't be appeased or ignored. If Nazi Germany won this war, the kind of society that Canada was trying to build would become impossible anywhere in the world. This moral dimension gave the Second World War a clarity of purpose that the First World War had sometimes lacked. There were no difficult questions about whether Canadian interests were really at stake, no complex debates about imperial obligations versus national autonomy. Nazi Germany was a threat to everything that Canada stood for, and stopping that threat was worth whatever sacrifices were necessary. The Canadian war effort that began in September 1939 would eventually involve over 1 million men and women in military service, transform the Canadian economy into one of the most efficient war production systems in the world, and establish Canada as a major power with global influence and global responsibilities. But in September 1939, none of that was obvious. What was obvious was that Canada was about to face the greatest test in its history, and that the outcome would determine not just Canada's future, but the future of democratic civilization itself. The scale of what Canada was about to undertake was staggering. This wasn't going to be like 1914, when the country had stumbled into war with vague promises and uncertain commitments. This time, Canadian leaders understood from the beginning that they were entering a total war that would require mobilizing every resource the nation possessed. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, who had spent the previous decade carefully managing regional tensions and avoiding divisive policies, suddenly found himself having to make decisions that would reshape Canadian society in ways that peacetime reform could never accomplish. The man who had built his political career on compromise and caution was about to preside over the most dramatic expansion of government power in Canadian history. The first challenge was convincing Canadians that this war was worth fighting. The memories of 1914-1918 were still fresh enough to make people skeptical of grand promises about making the world safe for democracy. Too many families had sacrificed sons and fathers for causes that seemed less noble in retrospect. Too many communities had been left with empty chairs and bitter memories of politicians who had promised that the last war would end all wars. But Hitler's Germany was making King's job easier with every passing month. The invasion of Poland was followed by the conquest of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in a series of lightning campaigns that demonstrated Nazi military efficiency and Nazi ruthlessness. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against a German war machine that controlled most of Europe and seemed unstoppable. This was the moment when many Canadians realized that their country's survival might depend on the outcome of battles being fought thousands of miles away. If Britain fell, if the Royal Navy were captured or destroyed, Canada would face Nazi Germany across the Atlantic with no allies and no realistic hope of defending its vast coastline and scattered population centres. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over southern England during the summer and autumn of 1940, became a Canadian battle as much as a British one. The Royal Canadian Air Force contributed entire squadrons to the defence of Britain, and Canadian pilots flying British aircraft helped turn back the German air offensive that was supposed to clear the way for a Nazi invasion. But the real transformation of Canada began on the home front, where the government launched the most ambitious economic mobilization program in the country's history. The Department of Munitions and Supply, created in 1940 under the leadership of C.D. Howe, essentially took control of Canadian industrial production and redirected it toward military purposes with an efficiency that amazed even veteran industrialists. Factories that had been producing automobiles were retooled to manufacture aircraft engines. Textile mills switched from civilian clothing to military uniforms. Steel mills that had been struggling to find markets during the Depression suddenly had more orders than they could fill. The unemployment that had plagued Canada throughout the 1930s disappeared virtually overnight, as industrial production expanded to levels that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The transformation went beyond simple industrial conversion. Canada began producing military equipment that it had never manufactured before, often using technologies that had to be developed from scratch. The country that had imported most of its sophisticated manufactured goods before the war was soon exporting advanced aircraft, naval vessels, and electronic equipment to allies around the world. Canadian shipyards launched over 400 merchant vessels during the war, more than the country had built in its entire previous history. Canadian aircraft factories produced over 16,000 military aircraft, including advanced fighters and bombers that matched the best designs available anywhere in the world. Canadian munitions factories supplied not just Canadian forces, but British, American, and Soviet armies with shells, bullets, and explosives. This industrial achievement was remarkable enough, but what made it truly extraordinary was how quickly it was accomplished. The factories, the workforce, and the organizational systems that made this production possible were created in less than 2 years. Canada went from being a predominantly agricultural economy to being one of the world's major industrial powers faster than any country had ever achieved such a transformation. The social consequences were equally dramatic. The massive expansion of industrial production required workers, and Canada found them by bringing groups into the workforce who had previously been excluded or marginalized. Women entered factories and offices in unprecedented numbers, not just replacing men who had joined the military, but taking on jobs that had never been considered suitable for women. Indigenous peoples, who had been largely ignored by previous government programs, suddenly found themselves recruited for both military service and industrial work. Black Canadians, who had faced systematic discrimination in employment, discovered that wartime labour shortages created opportunities that had never existed before. Rural Canadians moved to cities in massive numbers, creating urban communities that were more diverse and more dynamic than anything the country had previously experienced. But the most significant change was psychological. Canadians discovered that their country was capable of achievements that nobody had thought possible. The same nation that had struggled through a decade of economic depression was now producing military equipment that was helping to win the most important war in human history. The same government that had seemed helpless in the face of unemployment was now organizing industrial production with unprecedented efficiency. This newfound confidence was reflected in Canada's increasingly independent role in Allied strategy. Unlike the First World War, when Canadian forces had served essentially as an extension of the British Army, Canadian units in the Second World War maintained their own command structure and often operated independently of British control. The Canadian Corps in Italy, which fought its way up the Italian peninsula from 1943 to 1945, developed tactics and gained experience that made it one of the most effective fighting forces in the Mediterranean theatre. The Canadian Army in Northwest Europe, which landed in Normandy on D-Day and fought through to the liberation of the Netherlands, proved that Canadian military leadership could plan and execute complex operations as effectively as any army in the world. The Royal Canadian Navy, which had consisted of a handful of small vessels in 1939, became the third largest navy in the world by 1945. Canadian naval forces played crucial roles in the Battle of the Atlantic, protecting the convoys that kept Britain supplied and preventing German submarines from cutting the lifeline between North America and Europe. The Royal Canadian Air Force operated training bases across Canada that prepared pilots from dozens of countries for combat duty. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, administered largely by Canada, trained over 130,000 aircrew members and established Canada as a major centre of aviation technology and expertise. These military achievements gave Canada a voice in Allied planning that would have been unthinkable during the previous war. Canadian representatives participated in major strategic conferences. Canadian opinions influenced Allied policy decisions, and Canadian interests were considered alongside those of much larger powers. But the war also created new tensions within Canadian society that threatened to recreate the divisions that had nearly torn the country apart during the conscription crisis of 1917. French Canadians remained suspicious of any conflict that seemed to benefit British interests more than Canadian ones. Western farmers worried that wartime economic controls favoured central Canadian manufacturers. Maritime provinces feared that post-war reconstruction would ignore their needs in favour of larger regions. The conscription crisis of 1944 brought these tensions to a head once again. Prime Minister King, who had promised that his government would never impose compulsory military service, found himself facing the same impossible choice that had destroyed national unity during the previous war. Military commanders insisted that voluntary enlistment wasn't providing enough replacements for combat casualties. French Canadian leaders threatened to withdraw their support from the war effort if conscription were imposed. King's solution was characteristically Canadian, a compromise that avoided the worst consequences of either extreme position while satisfying nobody completely. Conscription was authorized, but implemented gradually and selectively, providing enough additional soldiers to maintain military effectiveness while avoiding the mass resistance that had paralyzed Quebec during the First World War. The fact that this compromise worked, that Canada emerged from the Second World War with its unity intact despite facing the same pressures that had nearly destroyed it 25 years earlier, demonstrated how much the country had matured politically since Confederation. Canadians had learned how to disagree fundamentally about important issues while still working together toward common goals. This political maturation was matched by economic transformation that positioned Canada as one of the world's major industrial powers. The war had forced the country to develop manufacturing capabilities, technological expertise, and organizational systems that would serve as the foundation for unprecedented post-war prosperity. By 1945, Canada had the fourth largest air force in the world, the third largest navy, and an army that had proven its effectiveness on battlefields from Italy to Northwest Europe. The country had developed atomic energy capabilities, advanced aircraft manufacturing, sophisticated electronics production, and chemical industries that could compete with any in the world. More importantly, Canada had developed the confidence and international recognition that would allow it to play a major role in shaping the post-war world. Canadian diplomats participated in the creation of the United Nations. Canadian representatives helped design the international economic institutions that would govern post-war trade and finance. And Canadian leaders were consulted on major policy decisions by allies who had learned to respect Canadian judgment and Canadian capabilities. The end of the war in August 1945 found Canada in a position that would have seemed impossible just 6 years earlier. The country had not only survived the greatest conflict in human history, but had emerged stronger, more prosperous, and more influential than ever before. The question now was whether Canadians could translate wartime achievements into peacetime progress, whether they could build on wartime unity to create a society that would be worthy of the sacrifices that had made victory possible. The answer would define the next phase of Canadian history, as the country that had proven itself in war, prepared to face the challenges and opportunities of peace in a world that had been transformed as completely as Canada itself had been transformed by 6 years of total war. The veterans who returned home in 1945 and 1946 came back to a Canada that was barely recognizable as the country they had left. Cities had grown larger and more industrial. Women had gained economic independence and political influence that would be impossible to reverse. The federal government had acquired powers and responsibilities that would have been unthinkable before the war. And perhaps most importantly, Canada had gained international respect and influence that opened possibilities for global leadership that had never existed before. But these returning veterans also brought with them expectations that would reshape Canadian society in ways that nobody could have predicted. They had fought for democracy and human dignity, and they expected to find those values reflected in the society they had risked their lives to defend. They had been promised that this war would create a better world, and they intended to hold their government accountable for delivering on that promise. The result would be the creation of the modern Canadian welfare state, a society that would attempt to guarantee economic security and social justice for all its citizens. The Canada that emerged from the Second World War would be more prosperous, more equitable, and more influential than anyone had dared to imagine when the country had first declared war against Nazi Germany in September 1939. But it would also be a Canada that faced new challenges and new responsibilities that would test whether the unity and confidence gained during wartime could survive the complexities of peace in an increasingly dangerous and divided world. The transformation that awaited Canada in the post-war world was unlike anything the country had ever experienced. This wasn't just about soldiers coming home and factories retooling for civilian production. This was about a nation that had discovered its own capabilities under the most extreme circumstances, and now had to figure out what to do with that knowledge in peacetime. Picture this: a country that had started the war with an economy still struggling to escape the Depression, now found itself with the world's fourth largest air force, third largest navy, and industrial capacity that rivaled much larger nations. Canadian factories were producing everything from advanced aircraft to sophisticated electronics. Canadian scientists had contributed to the development of atomic energy. Canadian diplomats were helping to write the rules for a new international order. But here's what makes this moment absolutely crucial. None of that mattered if Canada couldn't translate wartime achievements into peacetime progress. History is littered with countries that performed brilliantly during crises, only to fall apart when the crisis ended. The question facing Canada in 1945 wasn't whether it had won the war, but whether it could win the peace. The answer would determine not just Canada's future, but its place in a world that was being fundamentally reorganized around two superpowers that dwarfed every other nation on Earth. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's dominant economic and military power. The Soviet Union controlled half of Europe and was rapidly developing its own atomic weapons. Where did that leave a country like Canada, too large to be ignored but too small to compete with the emerging superpowers? The solution that Canadian leaders developed was both brilliant and risky. Canada would become the world's first middle power, a country that punched above its weight through skilled diplomacy, moral leadership, and the ability to build bridges between larger powers that couldn't communicate directly with each other. This strategy required something that Canada had never possessed before: a coherent vision of what kind of society it wanted to become. The war had proven that Canadians could work together to achieve remarkable things when they shared a common purpose. The challenge was maintaining that unity and sense of purpose when the immediate threat had been removed. The veterans returning home provided both the inspiration and the pressure needed to create that vision. These weren't just soldiers looking for jobs and housing. These were citizens who had risked everything for democratic values and now expected those values to be reflected in the society they had fought to defend. They had been promised a better world, and they intended to collect on that promise. But their definition of better went far beyond simply returning to pre-war conditions. They wanted economic security that would prevent another depression. They wanted social programs that would provide dignity and opportunity for all citizens. They wanted a country that would be worthy of the sacrifices they had made and the comrades they had lost. The response was the creation of what historians call the post-war consensus, a shared understanding that government had a responsibility to ensure full employment, provide social security, and create opportunities for all citizens to participate in national prosperity. This wasn't socialism, but it wasn't laissez-faire capitalism either. It was something distinctly Canadian, a mixed economy that combined private enterprise with public responsibility. The cornerstone of this new approach was the commitment to full employment. Never again would Canada allow unemployment to reach the devastating levels of the 1930s. The federal government would use all the tools it had developed during wartime to maintain economic stability and ensure that anyone willing to work could find a job that paid enough to support a family. This commitment required expanding the role of government in ways that would have been considered radical just a decade earlier. The federal government became the manager of economic growth, using fiscal and monetary policy to smooth out the boom and bust cycles that had plagued capitalist economies for centuries. Crown corporations were created to operate in sectors where private enterprise couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate service. Regional development programs were established to ensure that all parts of the country could share in national prosperity. But the most visible symbol of this new approach was the expansion of social programs that would become the foundation of the modern Canadian welfare state. Family allowances, introduced in 1945, provided direct government payments to families with children, recognizing that raising the next generation was a national responsibility, not just a private burden. Unemployment insurance was expanded to cover more workers for longer periods. Old age pensions were increased and made available to more seniors. The crowning achievement was the introduction of universal health care, a system that would guarantee medical care for all Canadians regardless of their ability to pay. This wasn't just a social program, it was a statement about Canadian values, the belief that access to health care was a right of citizenship, not a privilege of wealth. The healthcare system began in Saskatchewan in 1947, when the CCF government of Tommy Douglas introduced universal hospital insurance, despite fierce opposition from doctors and insurance companies who predicted economic disaster and medical chaos. Instead, the system worked so well that other provinces began demanding similar programs, and by 1968, universal healthcare had become a truly national system. But here's what makes this period so remarkable. Canada was building this comprehensive welfare state while simultaneously experiencing the greatest economic boom in its history. The 1950s and 1960s weren't a choice between prosperity and social justice. They were proof that a country could have both if it was smart enough to organize its economy properly and fair enough to share the benefits of growth. The post-war boom was built on several foundations that made Canada uniquely positioned to prosper in the new global economy. The war had created industrial capacity and technological expertise that could be adapted to civilian production. The immigration boom brought millions of new Canadians who provided both labour and markets for expanding industries. The resource sector benefited from global demand for the raw materials needed to rebuild war-torn countries and supply rapidly growing economies. But most importantly, Canada had developed something that money couldn't buy and politics couldn't create: a reputation for competence, reliability, and fair dealing that made it an attractive partner for countries around the world. Canadian companies found markets for their products not just because they were competitive, but because Canada itself was seen as a trustworthy supplier that would honour its commitments and provide quality goods and services. This reputation was particularly valuable in the emerging Cold War, where many countries wanted to avoid choosing sides between the United States and Soviet Union. Canada offered a third option: a democratic, prosperous nation that was allied with the West, but maintained enough independence to serve as an honest broker in international disputes. The Korean War, which began in 1950, demonstrated how this middle power strategy could work in practice. Canada contributed significant military forces to the United Nations' effort to defend South Korea, but it also played a crucial diplomatic role in preventing the conflict from escalating into a global war between the superpowers. Canadian diplomats helped negotiate the armistice that ended the fighting and established the framework for managing Cold War tensions. The Suez Crisis of 1956 provided an even more dramatic example of Canadian diplomatic innovation. When Britain and France invaded Egypt in a misguided attempt to regain control of the Suez Canal, the world faced the possibility of a larger war that could involve the superpowers. Canadian External Affairs Minister Lester Pearson proposed the creation of a United Nations peacekeeping force that would allow the invading powers to withdraw while maintaining stability in the region. This wasn't just another diplomatic compromise, it was the invention of peacekeeping, a new form of international intervention that would become one of Canada's most important contributions to world peace. Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in resolving the crisis, and Canada became the leading contributor to UN peacekeeping operations around the world. The success of Canadian peacekeeping reflected something deeper about the country's approach to international affairs. Canada had learned that small and medium-sized powers could have enormous influence if they were willing to invest in international institutions and multilateral cooperation rather than trying to compete with superpowers through military build-up or economic nationalism. This approach required sophisticated diplomatic skills and long-term strategic thinking that distinguished Canadian foreign policy from the more reactive approaches of many other countries. Canadian diplomats became known for their ability to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, to build coalitions among unlikely partners, and to maintain dialogue even when other countries had stopped talking to each other. But Canada's growing international influence was matched by equally dramatic changes in domestic society that were transforming the country's culture, politics, and identity. The immigration boom that had begun after the war was bringing people from countries that had never been significant sources of Canadian immigration before. Italians, Greeks, Portuguese, and other Southern Europeans were joined by increasing numbers of immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And there you have it. The entire unbelievable story of Canada. From those first Indigenous peoples who built sophisticated civilizations on this land 15,000 years ago, through the collision of European and North American worlds, through the brutal struggles that forged a nation, through 2 world wars that transformed Canada into a global power, to the modern multicultural democracy that emerged from centuries of compromise, conflict, and incredible human determination. This isn't the boring story of polite people apologizing in the snow that most people imagine. This is the story of a country that survived against impossible odds, that chose cooperation over conquest, that built something unprecedented in human history. A nation that spans half a continent while somehow holding together peoples who speak different languages, practice different faiths, and came from every corner of the earth. Canada matters because it proved that democracy can work on a massive scale, that diversity can be a source of strength rather than division, and that a country can be powerful without being imperial, influential without being aggressive, prosperous without being selfish. The story isn't over, and the challenges ahead are as daunting as any Canada has ever faced. But if history has taught us anything, it's that Canadians have a remarkable ability to find solutions that nobody else thought were possible.